Here goes this YouTube thing, I guess. Hi, my name is John. You may know me from such excellent shows as Beep Beep Lettuce or Work Stoppage, but since those shows are relatively small podcasts, you may not know me at all, and that's fine. I'm still going to tell you about Scientology and its influence on the current Trump administration. It's possibly not the most pressing issue facing the American public relevant to his administration and their goals, but since I haven't seen very much coverage from this angle, I thought I would do us all a favor and compile a non-exhaustive list of the tendrils which link the Trump admin to this destructive and insidious cult. Firstly, a note on the word cult. Many people have accused Trump of having a cult-like following or a cult of personality, and while these terms are not necessarily off the mark, they use the term cult rather euphemistically to make these points. I'm here to use the term literally. While I don't think Donald Trump is a literal cult leader, I have different feelings about the Church of Scientology. Scientology is a literal cult, and a highly destructive one to boot. And they have a friend or three or more in the White House right now. So hopefully it won't take very long to elucidate this point, and to start, I need to get something else out of the way as well. This is not a video about what Scientologists believe. Although there's plenty of material that is ripe for ridicule there. You know, South Park famously already handled this, and while my gripes with South Park are many, I pretty much hate the show, their Scientology episode did do a really good job popularizing knowledge of a good deal of the batshit crazy things that Scientologists believe, like Thetans and Xenu, ancient hydrogen bombs, billion-year contracts, purification rundowns, auditing, e-meters, whatever. I'm not here to cover this stuff in detail because A, it has already been covered quite extensively, and B, I'm much more interested in the way that they operate in the real world than I am interested in what they tell the poor fools who have given them tens of thousands of dollars to go up the bridge to total freedom, which is what they call the process of ascending through the ranks and courses of their Scientology programs. Rather, I'm here to talk about the way that they operate in the United States and abroad to some degree, gaining influence, power, compromising materials, and most importantly, money. Before we truly get into it, however, I'd like to say a word about this video's sponsor, me. I made this using my own time and research. I wrote, shot, and edited this video entirely on my own. I pulled all the clips, read all the articles, even the music was made by me. And as someone with a deep-rooted mistrust of corporate influence, who will never insert an ad into any of his projects, I humbly ask that you check out either of my podcasts and consider donating to their Patreons for access to bonus episodes and the like. I may set up a Patreon for my YouTube channel if it gets off the ground, but since this is the first video, I have no way of knowing how likely that is to happen. In any case, there are links in the video description that you can use to send me some beer money or walking around cash. If you think the quality of my work deserves it, I think it does, but I'm terribly biased. In any case, just use your best judgment. Thank you. Now, back to the meat and potatoes. In many respects, the Church of Scientology operates like a blackmail ring, or compromat ring. These types of operations are employed by intelligence organizations, usually, among others, to entrap and manipulate the public authority, reputation, and behavior of influential figures such as celebrities or government officials. We saw during the Cold War that the CIA and KGB were quite keen to run honeypot operations or otherwise gather or generate evidence that would be compromising to certain state actors for various reasons, some ultimately benign and some less so. Once the individual in question is made aware that the opposing side's intelligence community has these materials, they become extremely pliable. Scientology has long positioned themselves as enemies of the U.S. intelligence community, along with the IRS in particular, and several other critical government organizations here in the United States. But there are two things about that which don't add up in the present day. One, Scientology itself has an intelligence community. At the top of it is something called the Office of Special Affairs, or OSA, although they used to be called the Guardian's Office. Among other things, these folks are in charge of administering the fair game policy employed by Scientology to conduct personal and professional and legal attacks on what Scientology calls suppressive persons. A suppressive person, or SP, is anyone that the quote-unquote church sees as an ideological or existential enemy to the organization, and typically references former members who have come out of the organization to tell their stories. It can also occasionally refer to those who were never in the church, but are active in trying to reduce the organization's credibility anyway. This is undoubtedly going to include me if this video does any kind of numbers, so please remember to like and subscribe if you want to see me get intimidated by a weird space cult full of lawyers and celebrities. Cool. Another critical element of the intelligence gathering capabilities of Scientology is what is called auditing. In fact, it might be one of the things they're most famous for besides all of the Xenu shit. Ironically named, in an organization that has evaded paying taxes for decades due to a flimsy IRS tax exemption, we'll get into that later, auditing is the primary process for which citizen Scientologists or public Scientologists pay big bucks to be a part of. It essentially consists of an auditor, which is a Scientologist trained specifically for the task, subjecting the aspiring Scientologist to a series of extremely invasive questions while reading the results of an e-meter, which you may have heard of. It's essentially one piece of the now widely debunked polygraph test. This monograph, as I sometimes think of it, because it only reads the conductivity of the subject's palms as opposed to a polygraph, which takes several pseudoscientific readings at once, is a device that, according to L. Ron Hubbard, allows the auditor to detect if the subject is being sufficiently truthful in their responses. This is actually a huge load of bunko. The e-meter is an idiotic device which does not do what it says on the tin, but that's hardly the point. If a subject is convinced that the e-meter is in fact a real piece of reliable scientific equipment, it creates an environment where they are scared to lie to the auditor, particularly if they genuinely believe in moving up the bridge to total freedom. These auditing sessions have always been recorded, and nowadays are often even recorded on video. The church holds onto these records indefinitely and is more than willing, even eager, to deploy them in service of cutting down an individual's credibility should they ever try to cross the organization or, in some cases, attempt to leave. Many ex-Scientologists have expressed shock at the degree of invasiveness exhibited by the auditing process, and rightly so. The questions are often sexual in nature, related to drug use, personal trauma, criminal activity, or anything else that is likely to be compromising to the public image of an individual. And unlike many other forms of gathering compromising materials, the quote-unquote church actually has the subject paying them huge dollar amounts for the privilege of being blackmailed in this way. This doesn't cover the entirety of the way that Scientology behaves as an intelligence-gathering blackmail ring, but it gives you an idea of the basic formula on which they rely. Promise total personal freedom, hook the subject into the auditing process, charge an extraordinary price for those services, and then retain the most compromising and personal information indefinitely in order to retain members and further extort or blackmail them into behaving publicly in a desired manner. That's the basic nuts and bolts. Scientology has the dubious honor of running the most successful infiltration campaign against the U.S. government ever. This is also worth saying in the history of the country. Operation Snow White, which took place during the 1970s, was a criminal conspiracy by Scientology to infiltrate many branches of the U.S. federal government, most notably the IRS, to steal or destroy records that were unfavorable towards the organization, or specifically L. Ron Hubbard himself. That's the founder and original leader of Scientology, if you were unaware. He was a big, ugly dude who wrote fairly bad science fiction and paraded around in Coast Guard uniforms, trying not to get kicked out of any more countries before eventually giving up after being kicked out of maybe the most psycho-friendly nation in the world at that time, Rhodesia, for claiming to be the reincarnation of Cecil Rhodes, at least until Hubbard came to believe that Rhodes had been a homosexual. This is a point of contention among Rhodes biographers. They don't seem to agree whether this may have been true or not, but it is certainly a possibility and seems to be what L. Ron Hubbard believed. Interestingly, the whole thing is a bit ironic, seeing as Hubbard himself seems to have been not entirely straight, but self-loathing takes a lot of forms and can easily be lensed through the dominant bigotries of the time, and that was a big part of Hubbard's modus operandi. Operation Snow White was, as I said, the largest infiltration of the U.S. government ever, to this day, as far as we know, and although it did not go off without a hitch, it did seem to be ultimately successful, as Scientology had their tax-exempt status returned a couple of decades later in 1993. The operation consisted primarily of agents from the then Guardian's Office, now OSA, getting entry-level desk jobs at various federal agencies. Once embedded in the everyday office environment and operating comfortably under the radar, they would begin the process of illegally collecting or destroying documents and records that showed Scientology or its founder in an unfavorable light. This also included bugging rooms where meetings on Scientology were to be held, but the primary thrust was document collection. For instance, by December of 1974, Gerald Wolfe and Michael Meisner had sent a shipment of stolen documents 20 inches thick to the quote-unquote church. Shortly thereafter, Wolfe broke into the office of IRS refund litigation officer Barbara Bird and began photocopying files using government paper. A terribly risky maneuver, especially when repeated on a regular basis, which it was. These Scientology agents also targeted such organizations as the U.S. Coast Guard Intelligence Agency and the Drug Enforcement Administration, more commonly referred to as the DEA, stealing and photocopying documents from their files as well. The organization also, in tandem with the intelligence gathering process, filed Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against the IRS and other agencies while instructing their agents on the inside to gather information on the way that the IRS was preparing for such a legal battle, to give them an edge in the courts. This all went on until 1977, when, after a long string of increasingly bold break-ins and thefts, they were ultimately caught. After a couple years of court battles, 11 high-ranking members of Scientology were indicted on 28 charges, including Mary Sue Hubbard, the wife of the cult's leader and founder, and head of the Guardian's Office. Scientology attempted to have the judge removed, and then attempted to stall the process by subpoenaing nearly 150 federal agents, but were ultimately unsuccessful in avoiding convictions for 6 of the indicted parties, including Hubbard's wife Mary Sue. Shortly thereafter, in November of 1980, 2 more Scientologists were convicted on charges relating to Operation Snow White, Jane Kember and Mo Budlong. We have a clip here of Jane Kember from the 1960s, alongside David Gaiman, father of Neil Gaiman, espousing the purported benefits of Scientology as an organization.
And what is Scientology? Good question. I put it to Jane Kember, who with David Gaiman, a one-time real estate agent, is a spokesman for the school.
We address the being, or the spirit, or the soul, whatever you wish to say the person is, and we raise or help that person to raise their level of awareness spiritually. And the more aware the individual becomes of himself and of others and of the environment, the more able he is to handle the environment, himself and others.
By 1990, all 11 defendants in the case were out of jail, and it was not long before Scientology was mysteriously given back their tax-exempt status in October of 1993, which you may recognize as the year that Bill Clinton took up residence in the White House. For these reasons, I think it's fairly reasonable to suspect that some kind of deal between the federal intelligence community and the so-called church was struck. A cursory glance at the history of U.S. intelligence reveals that they have absolutely zero compunction about working with sadistic fringe groups to achieve their ends, and by the end of the Snow White debacle, it had become clear that, despite being ultimately caught, Hubbard and his wife had been operating a very sophisticated and, in some respects, quite successful intelligence/counterintelligence ring. I haven't known the CIA or any other U.S. intelligence agency to let this kind of resource go to waste throughout their history, And although I will admit that this essentially amounts to conjecture on my part, I think it's a totally reasonable inference based on the sudden shift in federal attitude towards the church shortly after Bush Sr., previously head of the CIA, left the office of the president, and Bill Clinton, one of the most self-incriminating politicians ever to walk the earth, took his place. Now, far be it from me to base my thesis for this entire video solely on these shaky hypotheses stemming from the activities of the church, which took place 3 to 5 decades ago. But once we dig into the connections between the present day, Miscavige-led organization of Scientology and the current Trump administration, this laying out of the groundwork will reveal its relevance. It's also worth noting that in the Church of Scientology, whatever Hubbard wrote down is considered inviolable truth, sort of like the infallibility of the Pope. And as several ex-Scientologists and Scientology researchers have pointed out, this means that the organization is fundamentally incapable of changing course and only capable of changing minor strategic details in how they approach achieving the same goals set out by Hubbard himself. Anyway, that's the background. Let's get into the main story. On to the present day, on to the impetus for this video, and on to my particular case of brainworms that prompted this script. The Trump administration, in addition to being tied to several other cults by their appointees, such as Tulsi Gabbard's lifetime membership in the Science of Identity Foundation led by Chris Butler, Marco Rubio's childhood in the Mormon Church, and don't tell me the Mormons are not a cult, go listen to ex-Mormons on YouTube telling their stories, they are a cult. Or even Betsy DeVos's position as the wife of the Amway heir, Dick DeVos, and don't tell me Amway isn't a cult. Go watch ex-Amway distributors share their stories, or just watch Sean Munger's excellent 2-hour video on the Amway Tools cult. But the Trump administration of 2025 seems to have a particular attachment to figures who have close relationships with and receive funding from Scientologists and Scientology organizations. This may sound kind of batty at first blush, but as L. Ron Hubbard once said, when you become too incredible, you become invisible. And I think that's precisely what the Scientology angle of the Trump administration is doing right now, is being so incredible, and I mean that as a broken up word, incredible, it's hard to believe, that they have essentially become invisible. Since I mentioned brainworms earlier, let's start with the king of brainworms himself, the anti-vaxxer, the ominous blue liquid drinker, the limited hangout par excellence, and the ultimate guy with a weird voice, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. RFK Jr. has been appointed by the Trump admin to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, and was confirmed to that position this February. Kennedy has a long history of believing in pseudoscientific nonsense, laundering his position as simply being opposed to the abuses of Big Pharma. And while we should all be opposed to the abuses of Big Pharma, obviously, the tactics employed by RFK Jr. indicate that he's not operating on a basis of opposition to, for instance, monopolistic companies extorting the public in exchange for life-saving medications that they desperately need. Quite the opposite. RFK Jr. believes, somewhat ironically, that the drugs themselves are the origin of today's maladies. This is 100% in line with what Scientology espouses in their materials that vilify any kind of mental health treatment, whether that's therapeutic, psychological, psychoanalytic, clinical, or pharmaceutical. And while RFK Jr. is not himself a Scientologist, or doesn't seem to be, based on publicly available evidence, he does have a long history of collaborating with Scientologists in the anti-vax, anti-pharma, wackadoo, crunchy idiot sphere of influence that has long percolated in the United States, a country where opposition to an evil industry never seems to be actually focused on the real function of those industries, and usually relies on having an even crazier schizo take on whatever issue is at hand. In my opinion, this is largely due to a deliberate suppression of class consciousness across the nation that has been going on since before the Cold War. But this video isn't supposed to be me lecturing you on the functions of capitalism and the necessity of historical materialist analysis, although it easily could be. You see some of the books to my side here. So you're welcome. I'm not going to make you read several volumes of Capital, but you probably should anyway. It's a great book. Back to RFK. His history with Scientologists has two main vectors that I'd like to discuss. His connection to the Wisner-Baum law firm and his connection to the Nation of Islam. I know that second one especially sounds kind of nuts, but I have receipts, as we used to say on the 2016 internet, and I'm going to present them to you now in summary form. Firstly, Wisner-Baum is a law firm which was founded by Scientologists in 1985 as the Baum, Headland, Ariste, and Goldman law firm, but in 2023 changed its name to simply Wisner-Baum. This is a law firm helmed by Michael L. Baum, who has been a Scientologist for 50 years, and the other partner now lending his name to the firm, Brent Wisner, has been a Scientologist for 30 years. This firm specializes in lawsuits aimed at large pharmaceutical corporations and has been instrumental in muddying the waters not just around public perceptions of health technologies, such as medications or treatment or therapy, but also convoluting the public opinion about what exactly ought to be the primary objection to the practices of such large private pharmaceutical companies. Now, I cited information provided by the Genetic Literacy Foundation to support these claims. It might have shown up just on screen here a moment ago. And I want you to know up front that yes, I am aware of the fairly credible accusations that the Genetic Literacy Foundation is basically a front group for Monsanto. But if you're going to stay with me through this, you're going to need to accept something pretty difficult to swallow about this story. In stories about corruption, intrigue, corporate and state espionage, backroom dealings, money, capital, and public services, it's going to be quite rare to find someone on either side who is essentially a good person, who is a morally or socially upstanding individual, or member of a group that constitutes anything resembling good guys. I'm happy to be on the record saying that Monsanto is bad. The U.S. government is also bad. Scientology is quite bad, and nearly any other group that I might bring up during this video is ultimately probably quite bad. The United States is a society built on lies, theft, graft, corruption, blackmail, fraud, deception, intimidation, and underhanded tactics, both legal and not. If you think we live in a meritocracy, a just society, an authentic democracy, or anything of that sort, I regret to inform you that you're terribly mistaken. Sorry. We live in a scam economy, mixed with a gambling economy, premised on oligarchy and exploitation, as well as nepotism and the fundamental state of class warfare waged on the poor by the rich in this nation. This is the pyramid that Hubbard was trying to climb in his day. The ladder, which Miscavige seems to have ascended to an upper rung of, and the hierarchy that all of these federal grifters like RFK Jr. and Pam Bondi are being appointed to positions of power within. More on Bondi later, however. We're going to stick with RFK for now. It's been reported in several major news publications that RFK Jr. has a financial connection to the Wisner-Baum firm. He collects a fee from cases against pharmaceutical corporations, most notably Merck, that he refers to the firm for litigation. This came up in his pre-confirmation ethics committee hearing, during which Senator Warren brought up his financial stake in cases waged by Wisner-Baum against pharmaceutical giants, such as Merck. And according to Warren's Senate website, RFK Jr. has made nearly $2.5 million in legal fees from the firm, and will still be eligible to continue to receive such payments in one way or another. RFK sort of weaseled his way out of this conflict of interest, quite unconvincingly, I might add, by affirming that he would give all related proceeds and funds to his children instead of to himself. How this functionally resolves that conflict of interest seems to be primarily imaginary, but that's a point of discussion for a lawyer or constitutional authority, not for some YouTuber who is making his first video. Suffice to say, anyone whose last two brain cells haven't held hands and died during an ivermectin overdose can plainly see that RFK Jr. has not functionally distanced himself from these ongoing and future litigations, which will assuredly be extremely profitable to him and his family. The other primary vector of Scientological influence on RFK Jr.'s career has come through a rather unexpected source, the Nation of Islam. Many of you may be well aware that despite some superficial claims by Scientology that its tools can be used by anyone of any faith, this is not actually true. Scientology, particularly once you ascend to higher OT levels, operating Thetan levels, directly contravenes faith in any higher power, Abrahamic or not. In Scientology, the Thetan that constitutes your immortal identity or soul, something like that, is considered to be a suppressed god. And prophets, or major religious figures like Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, the Buddha, or any others, are considered to be illusions constructed by interfering parties such as Xenu, or the body thetans in your body, to confuse and suppress the spiritual power of the immortal, constantly reincarnating thetan that exists within you. However, this has not stopped the Nation of Islam from adopting auditing and Dianetics, as well as other Scientology practices and theories, into their organization. This is most likely because figures like Farrakhan, already quite cult-friendly, I might add, and arguably a cult leader himself, are primarily concerned not with the well-being of their followers or congregation, their spiritual wellness, or their mental state, but actually with making that sweet, sweet cash. Auditing is one of the fastest ways that I've ever seen to transfer wealth upwards in an organization, and it's hard to think that that was lost on Farrakhan when he encountered the process or incorporated it into his organization. And if you don't believe me, here's Farrakhan himself speaking on why Scientology is supposedly a boon to Nation of Islam members on 2 separate occasions, and RFK Jr. speaking to why he felt aligned with Farrakhan during a 2-decade period leading up to around 2023.
Now, I found something in the Church of Scientology where they developed a technique and a technology that is called auditing, where a person can be helped to pull things up in their minds that they may even deny presently that it exists in their lives. This auditing process helps us to find those memories and bring them up. The auditor is something like a therapist. He's not a therapist, because therapists talk, auditors listen. So I looked into something that I heard about 35 years ago by the man who was my first minister, and I was his captain in Boston, Massachusetts. I met him again when the nation fell, and I was moved to Chicago, but then he was a Scientologist, and he began telling me about auditing. I heard what he said. I liked it because I love science, and I love when we can put scientific law, physical law, and the counterbalance of spiritual law and make them harmonize. I like that. I hate, listen to me good, I hate spiritual cowards who don't want to look at things and who feel that because I have something great, I can improve what I have by finding something that will make me a better representative of what I represent. I have been taking a lot of criticism. No, it's all right. It's all right. For attaching the nation to the Church of Scientology. So I wanted to say, look, you know, the critics are saying, oh, Farrakhan talking all this black talk and went over to this white man, L. Ron Hubbard. Stop. If it weren't so silly, I am you. I haven't
changed my religion? You know, all the prophets taught us to seek truth. From the cradle to the grave. It said, wherever knowledge is, you should seek to be a possessor of it. You know, some of you went to school. You went to college, didn't you? Some of you. How many of you in here have a college degree? May I see your hands? Were all your teachers black? They weren't? You mean to tell me you sat in a class with a white professor and got you a degree, and now you're working for white people, getting a salary?
First time I ever saw you speak was at the Fox Theater when Vaxxed, the documentary, came out. I think, right? Vaxxed was when it came out. And I went to it, and it was you and Minister Louis Farrakhan. And I thought the whole time sitting there, how did these two guys get together? Can you talk a little bit about that relationship? Do you mind?
Well, he asked me, you know, the Nation of Islam has always been skeptical about allopathic medicine. In other words, you know, the pharmaceutical paradigm. And Minister Farrakhan shares that skepticism. And I wrote a book about mercury in vaccines. The mercury was taken out of most vaccines, but it was left in the flu vaccine. But there are two kinds of flu vaccines. There are single-dose vaccines that most white people get. And then there are the cheaper kind, which are multi-dose, and those are loaded with mercury. What they call bolus doses, hundreds of times what you're supposed to put in your body. And those are given out mainly in rural and municipal clinics, and they're mainly given to minority populations. And I had written about this in the book, and Minister Farrakhan somehow got a hold of that and asked me to come out to Chicago and give a lecture to the medical personnel and to public health and social service groups in the Nation of Islam. And my attitude was, if I can save a kid, I'm going to, I'll talk. And so that that's how that relationship.
Farrakhan has also been linked to the practice of using Scientology to bleed a public school in Florida dry in an article printed in the Tampa Bay Times back in 2012. While RFK's relation to Farrakhan himself is concerning, there's another prominent Nation of Islam member that RFK Jr. seems to have an even better working relationship with, and that is Tony Muhammad. Tony Muhammad is a high-ranking member of the Nation of Islam. He is their regional representative on the West Coast, and is also a well-known Scientologist. In 2015, RFK Jr. appeared at a Scientology facility alongside Muhammad and the publicly disgraced Dr. Brian Hooker to peddle pseudoscientific and incorrect theories about vaccination, among other medical technologies, in opposition to a 2015 bill, California Bill SB 277, which was eventually passed in 2016. SB 277 eliminated personal belief exemptions to vaccination programs in the state of California, and that is precisely what they had all come together to fight against. He can also be seen with a security escort from the Fruit of Islam, the security and enforcement detail of the Nation of Islam, at a protest against the CDC, also from 2015. Additionally, RFK Jr. also co-produced a film with Tony Muhammad in 2021 called Medical Racism: The New Apartheid, which used the COVID pandemic as well as plenty of legitimate concerns about the grossly substandard medical treatment of black Americans to peddle nonsense about vaccines and promote various pseudoscientific beliefs which dovetail nicely with the type of universalist, anti-drug, anti-medicine, anti-psychology stances promoted by the Church of Scientology themselves. So we've established that RFK Jr. is deeply enmeshed with Scientology quackery, both by receiving money from Scientologist lawyers at the expense of muddying the waters around criticism of healthcare corporations, and by allying frequently with Scientologist Nation of Islam members to promote dishonest critiques of what is in fact a very racist medical system, which definitely should be confronted by people who are not whack jobs, such as RFK Jr. and his friends. The issue of medical racism is very real and very dangerous, and that's a big part of the reason that the behavior we've seen from RFK Jr. and his buddies is such a travesty. Instead of receiving any kind of reasonable explanation or plan of action from these grifters, people who are concerned about a very real problem affecting their communities are encouraged to fall down a rabbit hole of pseudoscience and false information. This is not at all dissimilar to the way the Scientology-run drug rehab centers called Narconon operate, taking the very real issue and serious issue of drug addiction, which destroys millions of lives, and spinning it into a money-making operation that has as little to do with science as it does actually caring about the well-being of those affected. All in all, a pretty damning history for the current head of Health and Human Services, which oversees medical policy decisions across the country. But unfortunately, the relationship between the Trump admin and the so-called Church of Scientology absolutely does not end there. Pamela Jo Bondi, frequently just called Pam Bondi, is the current United States Attorney General for the Trump administration. She was confirmed and sworn in this February, just like RFK Jr. And if there's a position in the federal government that the Church of Scientology would want to have a friend in charge of, it's this one. Scientology is one of the most litigious organizations ever to exist, and according to an article from the St. Petersburg Times from 1998, when the IRS did eventually return Scientology's tax-exempt status to the organization, not only did Scientology agree to pay $12 million in back taxes, which was of course a pittance compared to the billions of dollars held by the organization, but they agreed to drop the more than 2,000 lawsuits, I've seen estimates as high as 3,000, filed against the IRS by individual Scientologists. It's hard to say how many current or previous lawsuits have been filed by the Church of Scientology, but suffice to say that if they can summarily drop over 2,000 cases at the same time, they are essentially in the habit of firing off lawsuits the way that a soldier fires a machine gun, and this is corroborated by many accounts of ex-Scientologists who have been sued and harassed for speaking out against the organization. Now you might ask, why do I think Pam Bondi is a friend to the Church of Scientology? Well, that's a very simple question with a very simple answer. An excellent article in Newsweek goes over the issue quite clearly. Bondi originally rose to the rank of Florida's first woman to be the state attorney general back in 2010. Some of you may know that Scientology is largely headquartered out of Clearwater, Florida, along with a few other locations such as their huge building in LA and the Free Winds cruise ship that they use as a mobile training base as it drifts around the Caribbean. But for Bondi's case, the Clearwater headquarters is our focus. During a re-election campaign in 2014, Bondi held a fundraiser at the base in Clearwater, hosted and organized by 6 prominent Scientologists, which the Tampa Bay Times reported on at the time. Christina Johnson, Bondi's campaign spokeswoman at the time, even told the newspaper that she was well aware that Scientologists were staging the event, further elaborating that Bondi first connected with Scientology in 2010, when she and other elected officials toured the Clearwater facilities. Ahead of the fundraiser, Johnson said, quote, "It's like-minded folks sharing the same goals, protecting children against drug overdoses and human trafficking." I suppose we're just meant to dismiss that as a totally normal, reasonable, good faith thing to say. But anyone that knows a damn thing about Scientology knows full well that their drug rehab programs, as we've previously mentioned, are rampant with abuse and have an unbelievably low success rate. I'll put on screen some reviews from A Forever Recovery, which is a local Narconon in my area, located in Battle Creek, Michigan, which eventually shut down. And I'm also going to show you the mansion previously owned by Per Wickstrom, the incredibly wealthy Scientologist who ran this center, among several others, and who was forced to put his Battle Creek, Michigan mansion up for sale after being divorced by his wife. The mansion being so fucking batty and absolutely wild that it actually generated a whole bunch of local news posts about what this listing was doing on Zillow. I hope to make a video just focusing on the town of Battle Creek fairly soon, as it seems to be a locus point for weird cult shit, Seventh-day Adventism, the bizarre life of the Kellogg family, including the eventual involvement of Dr. Lena Sadler, who used to be Dr. Lena Kellogg, in the creation of the Urantia book, if you know anything about that. And also, Battle Creek has the only FBI office in the state outside of Detroit. It's not in Grand Rapids, it's not in Lansing, it's in Battle Creek for some reason. There's even a pretty bad show about Battle Creek's FBI office that only got one season. But that's not what this video is about. Additionally, the claims that Scientology gives a rat's ass about human trafficking are patently laughable. Scientology itself is more or less a human trafficking organization that routinely employs child labor and traffics those children as well as some adults who are either in the C organization or have simply run afoul of Miscavige to, be trafficked to wherever their hyper-exploited labor is required by the church. These children and adults are typically paid either a fraction of minimum wage or, probably more often, nothing at all for their work, and are subject to prison-like conditions if they fail to meet the standards of Scientology in the course of their duties. To argue that Scientology somehow stands against human trafficking indicates either colossal stupidity and blindness, willful ignorance, deliberate dishonesty for personal gain, or a combination of all three. Seeing as Bondi has risen to the highest legal office in the executive branch of the federal government and has access to nearly any resources she would like on any topic at all, I find it difficult not to emphasize the last one, deliberate dishonesty for personal gain. In 2016, for instance, Bondi's office repeated the lie, with then spokeswoman Kylie Mason telling the Tampa Bay Times, quote, "Considering the seriousness of the issue, the Attorney General is open to talking to any organization about what our office is doing to combat this awful crime and educate them on what they can do to help." End quote. And if you've been paying even a little bit of attention, I know you might be eating, it's fine, you might have some reservations and suspicions about this wildly incongruous statement, and you would be absolutely right to harbor those. Donald Trump himself said in November of 2024, when he posted to his Truth Social account, quote, "For too long, the partisan Department of Justice has been weaponized against me and other Republicans. Not anymore. Pam will refocus the DOJ to its intended purpose of fighting crime and making America safe again. I have known Pam for many years. She is smart and tough, and is an America First fighter who will do a terrific job as Attorney General." End quote. And I have to imagine David Miscavige feels pretty much the same way. Interestingly, if Trump has known Bondi for many years, which would be unsurprising considering the amount of time he spends at Mar-a-Lago, which itself is only 4 hours away from Clearwater, he must be well aware that she's closely tied to the Church of Scientology, particularly from the angle of campaign funding. He must also be well aware that her position as the federal Attorney General gives her an incredible amount of latitude to reward Scientologists that have gotten her there, either by dismissing cases, changing the interpretation of precedents, or merely being a highly visible mouthpiece for both the Trump admin and the church, who exists in a position of extremely potent legal power. I sincerely doubt this bothers Trump, however, as Trump himself has several major donors and boosters from the cult who he has rewarded with speaking spots at his rallies and other types of publicity and influence. In fact, I think he's pretty thrilled to have her on board for those exact reasons. Now let's get to the big orange boy himself. The reality TV star that currently occupies the White House, originally brought up in the public consciousness by pro wrestling appearances, personal PR campaigns, and generally being the most racist landlord we've seen since the 19th century, is no stranger to taking money from shady figures, grifters, hucksters, con men, scammers, or even Scientologists. It's well known that Trump himself has run a few scams of his own and ended up in some pretty hot water for it several times, out of which he always seems perfectly capable of quickly swimming. Anyone with either a careful analytic assessment or an intuitive vibe check of the man should be able to easily deduce that he has no compunctions about using the money, power, and influence of the worst people imaginable to achieve his ends. And his relationship with Scientologists, particularly those who are big campaign donors, is no different. And I'd like to talk about 3 of those Scientologists. First up, Grant Cardone. Starting with Grant Cardone, a major Scientologist donor to the Trump campaign and known fraudster who gave the Orange Boy $850,000 via Bitcoin, I might add, back in August of 2024, and could be seen speaking at Trump's famous Madison Square Garden rally shortly thereafter in October, is a real fuckhead. Here he is palling around with Kash Patel, the Trump admin's new head of the FBI. Here he is praising Trump for gutting the IRS, Scientology's longest-standing enemy, on Fox News.
Joining us now, Grant Cardone, Cardone Capital CEO and fund manager. Grant, they are so upset about these cuts. Why are they so worried?
Well, because they're thieves. These are parasites on the American people. It's a Ponzi scheme. They collect $5 trillion. I think the American people don't understand the IRS and what they actually do. They collect $5 trillion a year from American people, mostly not corporations, American people, regular middle-class people. Those super wealthy have figured out how to get by it. 50% of that money is from income taxes, okay? It's taken literally, $2.5 trillion away from the American people. $1.8 trillion comes from withholding. And then 10%, Laura, listen to this, 10% are penalties. $500 billion a year the American people are charged by the IRS for penalties alone. We should get rid of the IRS. We should go to a zero tax. First of all, audit the IRS and you will get rid of them because the amount of fraud there is unbelievable. We should go to a zero tax, and then when the American people, for some situation, whether it's the military or whatever, needs money, we print money. Right now we do both. We print and we tax. We should do one or the other, and I would say print and make sure the American people are behind it. Otherwise, don't tax the American people.
Well, you actually, it turns out, you could get a Doge check with all this savings sometime soon. Watch.
All of this despite standing class action lawsuits against his business for fraud, legal action against his partner Gary Brecka, who claims to be a biohacker and longevity expert, which is never creepy or weird at all, despite essentially just being a garden variety supplements and personal training guy who mostly hawks the same kind of brain-dead scam products that you would expect from Joe Rogan type figures. Cardone also speaks positively of privatizing the entire state of California to prevent future catastrophes such as those experienced during the recent fires.
How big it is, so you can't let it fail. And these fires could be as big as the Tarp Island. Okay, so right now, from the day one, they said it's 50 billion. I said it's not 50 billion. It's going to be 500 to 700 billion dollars because they could take 12 or 14 years doing this. And time is money. The longer something takes, the more money they're going to make. The other thing is I get rid of FEMA right now. And let the people clean up. Let me go clean up my stuff.
A lot of these organizations have been so mismanaged. It's almost like you have to take them down to the ground. You have to start over.
Yeah, that's right. You go to zero-based budgeting. Basically, go to zero.
But you start add in the things that make sense.
Then you add back whatever you need.
But then you have the liberal media that's actually twisting that, saying we're getting rid of important programs. So what do you have to say about
like what important program we get rid of?
Well, I mean, I think we're funding transgender comic books in Gaza. They're pretty upset about that one.
but I was with Trump 2 days ago.
And routinely posts some of the most obvious and idiotic right-wing grifter flim-flam shit that you could possibly conceive of to his Instagram account, as well as garden variety racism and other shit that you would expect from freaks of his caliber. I'm just going to play some of the craziest stuff I can find for you right now instead of talking, because honestly, I think this guy does a better job of incriminating himself as a psychotic bastard than I ever could.
What is the difference between a Jew and an Israeli?
For sure. An Israeli, Jewish is a religion. Israeli means you're a citizen of the state of Israel.
Okay, so I've never met a Jew. Is that inappropriate to say
No,
it like
not
that?
at all. You can say whatever you want with me.
I'll say that, and my wife will be like, I'm like, what's wrong, dude? Like, you could say Jew. Like,
yes,
it's not a bad thing, right? It's a person's religion. And Jewish people have different levels of religion, but I've never met a Jew that didn't like me.
I believe that 100%. Because I'll tell you why. Because your values are very much consistent with Jewish values. Like the things you promote and push. Jewish people are very, very ambitious. They want to be very successful.
Yeah.
And the parents really emphasize that to their kids, whether that be through education, whether that be through, we could talk about the education system, that's its own thing. Like, let's just say 40 years ago, right? The way to it actually made much more sense to go to school and get an education.
Yeah.
Versus right now where it makes far less sense. And the Jewish community is like much more now in like, you don't need school. Like they've adapted to that. But ultimately underlying it all is the ambition for wanting their kids to be successful.
Survival, man. Survival.
Yeah, and they just want good values. Just be a good person. It's really not. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but I think there's also a commitment to prosperity.
For sure.
That's not lined up with money and cars as much as it is a survival mechanism. Like, you need money.
I have been pushing for a zero federal tax for years. There's absolutely no reason for the IRS, no reason for us to be paying federal taxes on income. Give that money back to me. I will reinvest it in my community.
When I was doing Undercover Billionaire, bro, I was alone. When I take on new things, bro, I'm like, am I doing the right thing? Not doing the right thing? Is this the right thing? Should I do this thing? I don't know how to do this. I've never done this before. Everything, my whole life has been this, I don't know what I'm doing. So when a guy says, oh, you haven't had experience with this, I haven't had experience with anything. I didn't know how to write a book. I didn't know how to speak on stage. I didn't know how to do a podcast. I didn't know how to get an Instagram channel. I didn't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be a husband. I don't know how to come to the state of California and get them excited and rally them. I don't know how to do an interview.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do anything, dude. Don't let people quit, fire them first. If people are leaving your company, that's a problem because you should have fired them. They shouldn't have left you.
Yeah, because the attitude element.
Well, they quit, dude. They didn't leave. They left 3 months after they quit.
Right.
They quit in October and they left in January. You should have fired them in November because there's no way their stats went down when they decided to quit. They don't have the courage to quit. Most people don't have the courage to just walk out.
Moving on to Trish and Bob Duggan, another set of Trump allies in the financial political arena, are a former married couple, Bob and Trish, who have donated absurd amounts of money to the Trump campaigns, but have donated even more to Scientology. In a Tampa Bay Times article from 2019, Bob Duggan revealed in a phone interview that despite no longer appearing in any Scientology-related publications since his split with his ex-wife Trish in 2017, he has continued to give large sums of money to the church. Declining to elaborate on the exact figure, he instead indicated that it merely, quote-unquote, far exceeds the $360 million figure he cited to Forbes back in 2016, saying, quote, "I'm not looking for bragging rights. I read something from L. Ron Hubbard every day and apply it all through my life. I'm not running around with a badge saying, 'Step aside, I'm a Scientologist.'" End quote. He also added, quote, "I'm probably one of the wealthier people that have created more wealth on the planet than few others, and people don't know my name. I'm not here for people to know my name." End quote. Oddly, despite what Mr. Duggan may wish, I think it might be pretty important to know his name, since he moves obscene amounts of money and influence around at will to promote cults and fascistic politics all across the country, including donating $817,000 to the Trump campaign back in 2020. This donation, however, is nothing compared to his ex-wife Trish. She is also a committed Scientologist and has been steadily donating millions of dollars to the Trump campaign since 2023, totaling in excess of $7 million between her donations to various Trump-related campaign organizations such as Make America Great Again, Inc. and the MAHA Alliance, which stands for Make America Healthy Again Alliance, which is spearheaded by the former Team Kennedy content team, as evidenced by their Facebook bio. Really coming full circle here, aren't we? Additionally, Trish Duggan was recently appointed to the board of the Kennedy Center, of which Donald Trump was just recently elected board chair by the appointees that he put on the board. Extremely normal shit. So, I'm sure these two know each other quite well, and Trump and Duggan seem to have a pretty good working relationship. And I hope, at least, that if you've made it this far into the video, that you'll see that this is more than some incidental issue or a little blip on the radar. These working relationships are forming the foundation for the future of the Trump admin in many respects, and anybody who is not a committed Scientologist should be more than a little worried about that. I hope I'm not boring you, and I know we're reaching the limits of the attention economy with the runtime of this video, so let me just bring up one more malicious actor that bridges the gap between the Church of Scientology and the Trump admin, Joy Villa. Joy Villa, or Joy Villa, I'm not sure how she says her name. I don't really care, I suppose, is one of those celebrities that you probably didn't even realize was famous. You're probably looking at your screen going, who the fuck is that? This is pretty common among Scientology celebrities. After all, you can't all be Tom Cruise or Danny Masterson. Not that you would want to. Can't even all be Emily Armstrong or Steve Barra. Again, not that you would want to. But Villa seems to have truly been plucked out of the ether. And except for her extremely niche success in the right-wing dipshit performer pipeline that produced guys like Tom McDonald, it's extremely unlikely that you've heard anything about her other than 1, she is somehow famous, 2, that she's a big old fucking Trump cheerleader, and maybe even 3, that she is a Scientologist. She even recorded some of her tracks from the earlier part of her career at Clear Track Studios in Clearwater, Florida, operated and owned by the Church of Scientology. Her music is unbelievably generic, pop-adjacent trash that unabashedly bites the style of some of the most uninspired and insipid pop songs in history. That is, when it's not busy trying to sound like adult Christian contemporary rock music. This is all secondary to the real point, however, as her musical career, such as it is, seems to be little more than a platform for her to gain access to award ceremonies and other centers of cultural relevance in order to loudly declare her support for Donald Trump and Trump-adjacent scam shit like meme coins. You can see her here in her meme coin dress and MAGA hat, looking like an absolute fucking moron. Additionally, Villa is an unrepentant anti-immigration freak, despite being herself a Latin American who points out that her family came here legally. This might pass muster to someone who doesn't like to look things up, but her father, Reverend Joseph Mario Villa, is reportedly an Italian-Argentine man who emigrated to the U.S. legally before setting up shop in Orange, California. I don't know if you know a lot about the history of German and Italian immigration to Argentina right after World War II, but if you do, you'll know that I find that to be more than a little suspicious for some very not YouTube-friendly reasons. It's hard to find concrete information about her family, however, because she is, after all, not actually very famous, aside from a couple of stupid little stunts, but she's proved herself over and over to be one of the most rabid Trump supporters in the celebrity sphere, and quite clearly seems to see no issue in the overlap between her Scientology background and her intensely fascistic politics. I suppose I wouldn't either if I were her, which again, you wouldn't want to be. Here she is with Ted Cruz. Here she is again with Ivanka Trump. And here's a flyer promoting her performance at the inaugural ball alongside John Voight. Hard to imagine such tepid bullshit music legitimately propelling her to this position, But I have to admit, I'm torn between believing that it's a deliberate quid pro quo between Scientology and the right-wing power players in this country, or if right-wingers really just do have that bad of taste. Of course, I'm only sort of kidding. It's definitely the first one. I don't know, man. What the hell do you want from me now? I've pointed out most of the stuff I could find on the relationship between Scientology and the Trump administration, and while this video has been by no metric at all exhaustive, I hope that it's given you a sense of how much more closely connected these two organizations are than they seem at first glance. I could have taken a detour into discussing the cult that Gabbard was raised in, the Science of Identity Foundation. I could have talked more about Rubio's Mormon upbringing, or I could have spent 20 minutes trying to convince you that the DeVos-run company Amway is essentially a secular cult. None of this felt particularly necessary, however, as if this video does okay, I should have plenty of time to tackle that stuff and more in future video essays, or whatever this counts as. What I wanted to do here was draw a few direct, concrete lines between these spheres of influence. I wanted to show you how the money changes hands, at least based on what we know from the press. And I wanted to give you something to keep in mind when you wonder why things are deteriorating so fast, but also in such an oddly specific manner. And if this video accomplished any of that, and you liked it, please like and subscribe, and comment on the video, and leave a review on another website, and follow me on Twitter, and listen to my podcasts, and all the good things. If it didn't accomplish those things, or if you didn't think the video was very good, whatever, man. I tried. All right. This has been John. Thank you so much. I love you. Goodbye.